Around 5,000 years ago, something happened on the grasslands north of the Black Sea that changed the genetic composition of an entire continent. Not slowly, not gradually, the way most demographic shifts play out across millennia, with a speed that has no clear parallel in the ancient world. Within a few centuries, possibly within a few generations, the people who had built Europe's Neolithic civilization, who had raised its megalithic monuments, who had farmed its river valleys for 3,000 years, were largely gone. Not from every place, not completely, but from the genetic record of most of Western and Northern Europe, the Neolithic farmers who had defined the continent effectively disappeared. What replaced them carried a different genetic signature, a different language family, and a different way of life. They came from the steppe, they moved fast, and they left a mark in the DNA of virtually every living European that has not faded in 5,000 years. This is the story of the Yamnaya, and what the ancient DNA reveals about who they were, what they did, and how they did it, is one of the most unsettling findings in the history of population genetics. The Yamnaya culture takes its name from the Russian word for pit, a reference to the burial style that first identified them archaeologically. They buried their dead in pits beneath large earthen mounds called kurgans, which still dot the steppes of Ukraine and Russia today. As an archaeological culture, they were identified in the early 20th century and recognized as an important Bronze Age steppe society. But for most of the century, they were treated as one player among many in the complex drama of ancient Eurasian prehistory. The ancient DNA revolution changed that assessment entirely. Beginning in 2015 with landmark studies published in Nature, and continuing through a series of increasingly comprehensive genomic analyses over the following decade, researchers began recovering and sequencing DNA from Yamnaya burials across the Pontic-Caspian steppe. What they found was a population with a specific and distinctive genetic profile, a mixture of ancestry from two older source populations, Eastern European hunter-gatherers, and populations related to ancient peoples of the Caucasus and Iran. This mixture had produced something genetically coherent, reproductively successful, and demographically explosive. The Yamnaya, the data showed, were not static, they moved. Beginning around 3000 BCE, they began expanding in multiple directions simultaneously, westward into Europe, eastward into Central Asia. Eventually their genetic descendants, or the descendants of closely related steppe groups, would reach as far as South Asia, contributing ancestry to the populations of India and Pakistan in proportions that are still detectable today. But it is the westward expansion into Europe that produced the most dramatic genomic signal. And it is in that signal that the most troubling question lives. Before the Yamnaya arrived, Europe was populated primarily by the descendants of Anatolian farmers who had spread across the continent beginning around 9000 BCE, mixing in various proportions with the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers they encountered. These Neolithic farmers had built a sophisticated world. They raised the megalithic monuments of Western Europe. Stonehenge was theirs, or built by people directly descended from their tradition. The passage tombs of Ireland, the dolmens of France, the stone circles of Scotland. These were not primitive people. They were skilled architects, organized societies, long-distance traders. And then the steppe expansion hit them. In Britain, the archaeological and genomic record shows that within a few centuries of the Beaker culture's arrival, a culture closely tied to the expanding steppe ancestry, approximately 90% of the Neolithic genetic heritage of the island was replaced. Not in the sense that 90% of the people died simultaneously, but in the sense that when you look at the genomes of people in Britain after roughly 2500 BCE, almost all of them carry predominantly steppe ancestry. The Neolithic farmers' genes did not disappear, they persist in small proportions in modern European genomes, but they were so thoroughly diluted that the population had been, in genetic terms, almost entirely replaced. In Central Europe, the transition is similarly dramatic. Studies of ancient remains from Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic show a near-complete genetic turnover in the centuries following the Yamnaya and corded ware expansions. The people who had built the Neolithic farming communities of Central Europe, who had maintained those communities for 2,000 years, left almost no genetic trace in the populations that came after them. This is not a gradual assimilation. This is not the kind of mixing that happens when two cultures trade, intermarry, and slowly blend over centuries. The The speed and completeness of the genetic turnover suggests something more violent, more asymmetric, and more catastrophic for the people who were already there. Here is where the data becomes genuinely difficult, because the genetic evidence for what happened is clear. The explanation for how it happened is not. Several mechanisms have been proposed, and the honest answer is that they are not mutually exclusive. The first is epidemic disease. The Yamnaya and their related steppe populations were mobile pastoralists who had lived in close contact with domesticated animals for generations. They may have carried infectious diseases to which European farming populations had little immunity, in the same way that European colonizers would bring epidemic disease to the Americas thousands of years later. A population decimated by disease is a population vulnerable to demographic replacement. You do not need organized conquest if the people you are displacing have already been reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. The second mechanism is direct violence. The archaeological record of late Neolithic Europe shows evidence of significant conflict. Mass graves, trauma on skeletal remains, the abandonment of settlements. The transition period was not peaceful. Whether the violence was primarily between incoming steppe groups and existing farmers, or between various competing steppe-derived groups, or some combination, is debated. But the record of physical conflict is real. The third mechanism, and the one most recently elevated by genomic data, concerns a specific and deeply disturbing pattern. A 2017 study, analyzing sex-specific ancestry in ancient European populations, found something striking. In the earliest phases of the steppe expansion into Europe, the ancestry shift was not symmetrical. The steppe ancestry appeared predominantly through the male line. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry, showed a slower and more gradual shift toward steppe lineages than the Y chromosome, which traces the male line. In plain language, this means that in the first generations of the expansion, steppe men were reproducing with local women at far higher rates than steppe women were reproducing with local men. This pattern is not consistent with peaceful migration and mutual intermarriage. It is consistent with the violent displacement of local male populations, with conquest. The phrase that has appeared in academic papers discussing this finding is the near-complete replacement of local Y chromosomes. The men who had built Neolithic Europe largely disappeared from the genetic record. The women, to a greater degree, did not. Their mitochondrial lineages persist more visibly in the subsequent populations. The men's lineages, predominantly, do not. To be precise about what the science says, and what it does not say. The genomic data establishes the pattern of replacement. It does not establish the specific mechanism, epidemic disease, violence, and social marginalization that prevented local men from reproducing, could all produce the same genetic signature. The data cannot tell us whether there were battles, or plagues, or both, or something else entirely. What it can tell us is that the outcome, for the men of Neolithic Europe, was catastrophic in reproductive terms. This is not comfortable history. It does not lend itself to simple narratives. Some researchers have been reluctant to describe the expansion in terms that echo later historical atrocities. Others have argued that sanitizing the genomic record by avoiding uncomfortable language does a disservice both to science and to the people whose descendants disappeared. The debate within the field about how to describe what happened is itself a window into the difficulty of writing history from bones. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The Yamnaya expansion, and the expansions of the closely related steppe cultures that followed it, produced the genetic foundation of modern Europe. Roughly 75% of the ancestry of contemporary Western Europeans traces to the steppe migrations. The languages spoken across Europe from Portugal to Russia, and across South Asia from Iran to Bangladesh, descend from the Proto-Indo-European language that the Yamnaya spoke. The words for father, mother, wheel, horse, and God, in most European languages, share roots that go back to those grasslands north of the Black Sea, 5,000 years ago. The Yamnaya did not simply leave a mark. They largely became Europe. There is one more layer to this story that the genomic data has revealed, and it changes the frame in a way that complicates any simple narrative of conquest. The Yamnaya were not, themselves, an ancient or primordial people. They were a mixture. The genomic analysis shows that the Yamnaya were themselves the product of a relatively recent admixture event, one that had occurred perhaps only a few centuries before their expansion began. Their ancestry, combined Eastern European hunter-gatherer populations, who had lived on the steppe for thousands of years, with populations related to the ancient peoples of the Caucasus, who were themselves descended from some of the earliest farming communities in Western Asia. In other words, the people who would transform Europe were themselves the product of a transformation. They had formed as a population from the meeting of two older groups, and the genetic and cultural toolkit they carried, including possibly horse domestication, wheel technology, and the proto-language that would become Indo-European, was itself a synthesis, rather than an inheritance from a single deep tradition. The conquerors were themselves the children of convergence. The culture that remade a continent was itself made, not inherited, assembled from pieces that had not previously existed together. And that synthesis, that specific combination of steppe hunter and Caucasus-related farmer, produced something with a demographic energy that no prior combination had generated. The Yamnaya expanded because something about who they were, their mobility, their economy, their social organization, their disease resistance, gave them an advantage that compounded rapidly across generations until it had reshaped a continent. Consider what this means from the perspective of the people they displaced. The builders of Stonehenge, whoever specifically laid those stones, were the descendants of people who had crossed from Anatolia thousands of years before, who had themselves displaced or absorbed the Paleolithic hunters who preceded them. The Neolithic farmers were not the original Europeans either. They were a previous wave, now being overwritten by the next one. The pattern that produced them was the same pattern that erased them. Mixture, expansion, replacement. The same process, running on a different population, in a different century, with a different outcome. This does not make what happened to the Neolithic farmers less significant or less worth mourning. It makes it more human. It places it in a sequence that has no clean beginning and no clean end. Every population that exists today is both the product of someone else's displacement and the ancestor of someone who may be displaced in turn. The Yamnaya are simply the most dramatic and best documented example in the ancient genetic record of a process that has been running since the first humans left Africa. The genomic data has given us something that no previous generation of historians possessed, a view of the past that does not depend on the written records of the victors, on the monuments of the powerful, or on the stories that any particular group chose to tell about itself. The DNA in ancient bones does not care about the narrative. It records what happened. What it records, in this case, is the near erasure of a world. The world of the European Neolithic farmers, the world that built the megalithic monuments, that developed the first European agricultural economies, that created the cultural traditions underlying much of what we recognize as prehistoric European civilization, was largely overwritten within a few centuries by a population from the East that moved faster, reproduced more successfully, and left almost no room in the genetic record for the people who had come before. The Yamnaya are at the center of European genetic history. They are the reason most Europeans alive today speak a language derived from the steppe. They are the reason the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge left so little of themselves in the genomes of modern Britons. And they are themselves the product of a mixture that preceded them, of older people coming together on the grasslands and producing something that the ancient world had not yet seen. They were never simply warriors from the steppe. They were, like every human population before and after them, the momentary result of history and motion. And the motion did not stop with them. It never does.